You fired him for helping my daughter? Unbelievable. Anthony, a humble janitor, lost his job for comforting a scared little girl in the hospital. But when her father, the hospital's CEO, found out, he was stunned. The next morning, Anthony walked back into the hospital, not as a janitor, but as the CEO's personal assistant. You ever hear of a man losing his job for being too kind? Well, now you have. Anthony Carter had worked at St. Vincent Private Hospital for 10 years. He wasn't a doctor, not a nurse, just a janitor. The guy who scrubbed floors, emptied trash cans, and mopped up messes no one else wanted to touch. He wasn't important, until one night he made the mistake of caring. It was late. The hospital halls were quiet, filled only with the faint beep of machines. Anthony was cleaning near pediatrics when he heard it, soft crying. He followed the sound and found her, a little girl, no older than 7, clutching a worn-out teddy bear, tears streaking down her face. Anthony crouched down. "Hey, sweetheart, you okay?" She sniffled. "Mama said she'd come back soon, but she never does." Anthony felt something twist in his chest. He wasn't supposed to talk to patients, just clean and move on. But how do you walk away from a crying child? He sat down next to her. "What's your name?" "Lily." Her voice was small. "That's a beautiful name." For a while they talked. He told her stories, about silly things, about the raccoon that once snuck into the hospital kitchen. And for a moment, she smiled. Then, the moment shattered. "Carter." A sharp voice cut through the air. Anthony turned. Miss Hudson, the chief administrator, cold, ruthless, and always one bad mood away from firing someone. She stormed toward them, her heels clicking like a countdown. "What do you think you're doing?" Anthony exhaled. "The girl was upset. You were just breaking protocol." Her tone was ice. "You are a janitor, not a social worker." Lily shrank against the bench. Anthony clenched his jaw. "This isn't right." "She was alone. That's not your problem." And then with zero hesitation, she said the words that sealed his fate. "You're fired." Silence. For comforting a child. For one moment of kindness. Miss Hudson turned, already done with him. Anthony stood frozen. Lily looked up, her big, watery eyes filled with something he couldn't stand to see. Guilt, like this was her fault. He forced a smile. "It's okay, kiddo." But it wasn't, not even close. Getting fired is one thing. Getting fired for doing the right thing, that's a whole different kind of burn. Anthony Carter had spent 10 years cleaning that hospital. 10 years of wiping up messes no one else wanted to deal with. Of scrubbing floors until they shined. Of being polite, even when people barely looked at him. And how did it end? With 2 words. "You're fired." Now, he was walking out of St. Vincent Private Hospital for the last time, a plastic bag in his hand with nothing but his uniform, and a last paycheck that wasn't even worth the paper it was printed on. It should have been just another job, but it wasn't, because now, every step away from that building felt wrong, like he was leaving something unfinished, like he was abandoning someone. The next morning, Anthony forced himself to go back one last time, not for some dramatic speech, not to beg for his job back, just to pick up his last check and walk away. Simple. At least, that's what he thought, until he heard her voice. "Where's Mr. Anthony? He promised he'd be here." Anthony froze. The voice was small, fragile, and filled with panic. He turned toward the sound and saw her. Lily. She was standing on her hospital bed, clutching her teddy bear, tears streaming down her face. A nurse, one Anthony had seen 1,000 times before, sighed, clearly impatient. "Sweetheart, Mr. Anthony doesn't work here anymore." Lily's little shoulders tensed. "But he promised." Her voice cracked on the last word. Anthony felt it deep in his chest, like a punch. He wanted to step forward, to tell her he was here, that it wasn't his choice, that he'd never break a promise to her. But he didn't. He couldn't. Because Miss Hudson had made it very clear he wasn't welcome here anymore. So he did the only thing he could. He turned around and walked away. Not because he wanted to, but because for the first time in his life, he had no choice. Hours passed. Anthony sat in his tiny apartment, staring at the ceiling, feeling like a man who had just lost his last reason to wake up in the morning. The room felt smaller than ever. The silence was thick, pressing down on him. His old work uniform sat crumpled in a bag by the door, a reminder of how quickly everything could be taken away. He had spent 10 years cleaning up after people who never once stopped to ask his name. 10 years of making sure everything was spotless for the doctors, the nurses, the administrators, the people who mattered. He had done his job, kept his head down, and expected nothing in return. And now, he was supposed to just disappear like he never existed. A part of him wanted to be angry. The kind of anger that sat deep in your bones, the kind you carried around even when you swore you let it go. But more than anything, he just felt empty. Then the phone rang, loud, shrill, cutting throughout the silence like a warning shot. Anthony frowned. Who the hell would be calling him? He almost ignored it, but something in his gut told him, pick it up. He reached for the receiver, pressing it to his ear. Mr. Carter? The voice on the other end was firm, authoritative, not someone calling to check in, not someone trying to sell him something. A voice that meant business. Yes? A brief pause, then, you need to come back to the hospital, immediately. Anthony sat up straight. The hospital? He asked, his voice sharper now, more alert. Why? Another pause. Then came two words that sent his heart slamming against his ribs. It's about Lily. His grip on the phone tightened. Lily. He didn't need to hear anything else. On my way, he said, already pulling on his coat. The hospital lobby felt different this time. Last night, he had left through those doors feeling like nothing, like a ghost. Now, he was walking back in, shoulder squared, heart pounding, not as a janitor, but as a man with a reason to be here. He scanned the room, expecting to see a nurse, maybe even Miss Hudson, standing there waiting for him, but instead he saw someone else. A man, tall, powerful looking. Expensive suit, the kind of man who didn't wait for things. Things waited for him. Anthony slowed his steps. Something about this man felt important. The man turned, piercing blue eyes locked onto him. Anthony had spent a lifetime reading people, and this guy wasn't here to waste time. Mr. Carter? Anthony's jaw tightened slightly. Yeah, that's me. The man stepped forward, extending a hand. Richard Pierce, I'm the CEO of this hospital. Anthony froze. CEO? He had spent 10 years working here, and not once had he ever been in the same room as this man. Why the hell would the CEO of St. Vincent Private Hospital be standing here, waiting for him? Before Anthony could even begin to process what was happening, Pierce said something that hit like a freight train. Lily is my daughter. The words crashed into him, knocking the air right out of his lungs. His daughter? Anthony blinked, tried to make sense of what he had just heard, because suddenly everything felt different. The little girl sitting alone in the hallway, the way no one had come to check on her, the way she had cried, waiting for a mother who never showed up. And now, this. He barely managed to speak. Your daughter? Pierce nodded, his gaze steady, like he was waiting for Anthony to fully grasp the weight of those words. The CEO of the entire hospital, a man with power, money, and influence. A man who, by all logic, should have never crossed paths with a janitor like Anthony. And yet, here they were. Anthony swallowed. Something told him. This conversation was about to change everything. For the first time in a long time, Anthony Carter was speechless. The CEO of St. Vincent Private Hospital, one of the most powerful men in the city, stood in front of him, thanking him, not just in a polite, corporate way, but with real emotion in his voice. Lily told me about you, Pierce said, his voice slightly unsteady. She told me how you were there for her when no one else was. I can't thank you enough. Anthony swallowed, still trying to process everything. This wasn't how the world worked. Men like Richard Pierce didn't thank men like him. She just reminded me of my granddaughter, Anthony admitted, his voice low. No kid should feel that alone. Pierce turned then, sharp, calculated, commanding, right at Miss Hudson. The air shifted. Hudson, who had spent years walking these halls like she was untouchable, suddenly looked Small. Is it true? Pierce asked, his voice calm but ice cold. You fired this man for helping my daughter? Hudson's face went pale. I was just following policy, she stammered. Pierce didn't blink. Then let me introduce you to a new policy. His tone was like a steel door slamming shut. This man is no longer a janitor. He's my personal assistant. Silence. Anthony's mouth fell open. Hudson's eyes widened. The front desk staff, the nurses nearby, everyone stopped. Did he just say personal assistant? Anthony shook his head. Sir, Pierce cut him off with a single look. No arguments. Then he added something that sent a shockwave through the room. If I have to shut down an entire floor to prove that kindness is valued in my hospital, I will. Anthony felt it. The weight of those words, the power behind them. Miss Hudson did too, because she didn't argue. She just nodded stiffly and disappeared. The next morning, Anthony walked back into St. Vincent Private Hospital. But this time, it was different. He wasn't wearing his janitor's uniform. No mop, no cleaning supplies. Instead, he walked through the halls in a crisp button-down and slacks. His new ID badge, assistant to the CEO, was clipped neatly to his shirt. People noticed him now. Nurses nodded. Staff greeted him. He existed. But none of that mattered as much as her, Lily. He stepped into her room, and the moment she saw him, her face lit up. Mr. Anthony! She practically launched herself forward, wrapping her tiny arms around his waist. He chuckled, ruffling her hair. Told you I wouldn't go anywhere, kiddo. She pulled back, beaming. Daddy says you're really important now. Anthony smiled, shaking his head. Nah, I'm just here to help. And for the first time in a long time, he knew. Goodness always comes back around.